Welcome to the Business of Learning, the Learning Leaders podcast from trainingindustry.com.
Hi, I'm Scott Rutherford, Director of Marketing at Training Industry.
And I'm Taryn, Oesch, Editor at trainingindustry.com.
Much has been made of the impact artificial intelligence and automation is having and will have on business and all of the individuals who work for businesses.
Today on the Business of Learning, we talk to Larry Boyer, consultant, speaker, and author of the new book, The Robot in the Next Cubicle, What You Need to Know to Adapt and Succeed in the Automation Age. Larry, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Larry, we hear a lot over the last couple of years about the fourth industrial revolution. Can you please explain for our listeners what exactly that is?
Sure. So, through history, we've had three other industrial revolutions, and we're now on the verge of a fourth one. The last industrial revolution we had, just for context, was one where we had a lot of computerization and automation that occurred. We saw some introduction of robotics into the workplace, especially in manufacturing. And as we've evolved, we're coming into a fourth one where we're starting to see a lot of new technologies come online. These can be everything from artificial intelligence to more robots, drone technologies, virtual reality, gene splicing and editing that we're seeing. So there's a lot of new technologies that are coming together. And what makes it an industrial revolution as opposed to just an evolution of existing technologies is the fact that all of these technologies are being developed at the same time, and then they're going to be able to work across each other and be combined in different ways, right? And so it's very difficult to see what the future will be with any of industrial revolution when you're at the starting point. And what you know is that there will be lots of disruption, changes to the way that we're doing things, changes to the way that we live. So it affects all aspects of the economy, not just work, but the way that we live as well.
So it affects how we have to live and how we work. And one thing that I observed, I was reading what you wrote in the book about the history of industrial revolutions. What struck me is, it seemed to me there is a little bit of parallel when you just talk about Moore's law being the tendency of change to happen at an exponential rate. The first industrial revolution was over the course of a couple of hundred years, the second over the course of 60 or 80 years, the third over the course of perhaps 40 years. Is the fourth industrial revolution all of this change that we have to adapt to with technology? And are we also having revolutions that change our world more rapidly than before? Is that what we have to expect?
I think that is an interesting question. So I think there are two parts to that, right? Is how fast individual components of the revolution are happening. So they are happening, I think, faster, like you said, with Moore's law. The unknown question is how long will it take for the entire revolution itself to shake out? And that one is a lot harder to say. Will it last 40 years, 60 years, or only 20 before things kind of stabilize into a new normal? In some respects, if it happens faster, that's a little bit better because in the past revolutions, if you look at them, right, that was the entire working life of a person, right? So if you started out at the beginning of your career, at the start of an industrial revolution, you would be retired long before it even ended. So your entire career would be through disruption. If we got through that a little bit faster, that would probably be better for the working person.
And of course, we have to adapt during our working lives, perhaps, to changes that we see. One of the changes that you write about in the book is artificial intelligence. And you describe three variations of AI, assisted intelligence, augmented intelligence, and autonomous intelligence. And I wonder if you could help us understand the differences between those and how they affect the workplace. Sure.
Well, I think one important thing to recognize about all of these is they're not necessarily exactly separate and distinct things, right? I would like to think about it as more of a spectrum, right? And so you can move from the more simple one, which is assisted intelligence, where you get some levels of automation. The computer is making some very simple decisions, and then kind of moving on and handing off the decision-making process to humans. Augmented intelligence is taking it a little bit more and bringing it and integrating it more with humans and human decision making. And then finally, the autonomous intelligence, where the machine is making decisions completely by itself, without the need for human interaction. And you can think a little bit about this maybe in the example of autonomous vehicles and the way they're working today, where maybe it's the car can drive itself for the most part, right? But we're still augmenting it with human intelligence, because we're saying the human needs to be paying attention to what the car is doing. The human needs to be able to override what the car is doing if it sees some kind of a dangerous situation, right? So that would be an example kind of where it's mostly autonomous, but it still needs that human augmentation for it. If we look at other examples where we see, again, some mixes of these, space vehicles, so like the Mars rover, right? It can do a lot of its tasks all by itself, but if it runs into a particular situation or a difficulty, it stops and waits for a human to look at what the situation is and then make some decisions about it. And then we've got everything from chatbots, which almost anybody who's been on Facebook has probably experienced chatbots. It's a little bit hard to avoid people marketing to you in that way. Right, where you start a discussion and you're interacting with the machine to start with that can provide some basic levels of information and services for you, and that's kind of it. But then you might get stuck somewhere, and then you need that human interaction. So it's really this spectrum, and I think it hits the workplace in many different ways. Everything from again, interacting with maybe a customer support and tech support, how calls get routed. Increasingly, more and more issues around data science and machine learning are being used to understand people's behavior. And again, a lot of it comes through marketing efforts that we see, but it's going to creep into the workplace in more and more ways as well, just to help us do our jobs better and more effectively.
If I'm understanding the implementation so far, we've had automation to this point, which has really taken root to replicate sort of formulaic tasks, things that you can place, sort of firm parameters and conditions on. But as we get further into creative or less structured decision making or even creative thought processes, that's where at least today's autonomous intelligence seems to struggle.
Right, and but I think what we all need to know is people are working very hard to do that and replicate the human creative process. And so there are programs out there, for example, that study music and create new compositions, and some of them are pretty good. The same thing with creating art, and people who are working in visual arts even use that today. Some of where the computer program can take a photograph and alter it and manipulate it in ways that help clean it up and produce a nicer looking photo. A lot of that can be done automatically. And so the days of machines producing art might be coming as well.
So looking a little bit further into the future, or maybe not that far, Mark Sager of Soul Machines believes that humanoid androids will actually be pretty common by 2027, which sounds far away, but is actually less than 10 years from now. So I want to unpack that a little bit. First of all, what exactly is a humanoid android? And do you agree with his statement that we're that close?
It's difficult to say for certain, but we already have kind of some humanoid type of robots that are out there that are interacting with people. They're not smooth; they're a little bit clunky still, but they're kind of interesting, right? So we've got things like there's a robot. One of the more popular ones is called Pepper, that walks around and interacts with people. You might see it at conferences and in different locations. And people find it interesting, right? So it's still a little bit more of a curiosity rather than a helper. We see, Boston Robotics is producing a lot of robots that can do things like walk up stairs. They can run. They can carry backpacks and do a lot of tasks. So those are getting closer and closer, and all it takes is a few breakthroughs to really make it happen. So it's hard to say, and predict actual breakthroughs. 2027 is not an outrageous time frame to think about seeing some of them. But will they be, humanoid androids like we might have seen if anybody saw the movie like Artificial Intelligence from years ago? where they actually had like a child, Android. That's probably much further in the future before we see something like that.
So at what point do you think these types of androids will have an impact on the workplace, and what will that look like?
Well, I think we're going to see robots in one form or another have increasing impacts in the workplace. The first places where we're going to see them is for dangerous tasks and things that are hazardous. So we'll see them in for whether it's warfare, maybe chemical, dealing with chemicals and dangerous chemicals. I just saw some robots just yesterday that Disney was developing to take the place of stuntmen and do a lot of the tasks that a stuntman might do. So I would say look for robots to especially be taking the place of people who are involved in a lot of dangerous tasks. So we'll see that, and then I think we're also seeing the development of robots. I think in medical care, both for anything from performing surgeries to some aftercare, and even companion robots. There are a lot of people who suffer from loneliness, and so having a robot companion, is something that we'll see more and more of. Where you can actually talk and interact with it. You'll have somebody around, and there's been, again, lots of developments in that area as well.
So this leads us to the topic of adapting to the technology, and as bots and robots take on tasks that would otherwise be performed by humans, or perhaps were performed by humans. It places a demand on not just companies to manage their workforces, but also individual employees to have a role in their individual continuing education. So they retain a set of skills that are current and marketable and in demand. So how do we begin to manage that, both from an individual continuing education perspective, but also from a company training perspective? How maybe you take the company perspective first. How does a company look at their workforce and their demands and make sure that the employees they have today can do the jobs that maybe, if I wanted to be a little bit pessimistic about, but do the jobs that are left in 5 years?
Right. Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head here, right? It's got to be from both perspectives, right? The company has some responsibility here, as well as the individuals themselves. So I think one of the things that a company needs to be able to do is look to the future and actually communicate to its employees what that future looks like and a path to get there. And it's not just about the business and the business processes, because that's usually what gets a lot of the attention. It's like, well, what do you have to do to be a part of that? And I think very few companies actually do that. I think AT&T was excellent at kind of communicating some of that vision and telling employees, here's where we're going to be in a few years. Here's the kinds of technology that we're doing. Now you have to come along and do that. Here's the things that you need to learn, so that you can go out and do that. And some of that may have to be on your own time, right? But they actually communicated that. I don't think a lot of companies are actually that clear with their employees. And a lot of times, corporate strategies are, well, if we want to adopt a new technology, we're going to just buy a new company, a startup that already is doing something like this, and we'll just plug it in and we'll let the people go who are there. And that's been a very traditional strategy. In the long run, especially as these new technologies develop, there aren't people who are experts in the new technology. So the company, from a sustainability aspect, I think also needs to bring its employees along. Now, that said, employees then also need to learn and adapt. They need to know something more about themselves and what their interests are and what their capabilities are, so that they can focus on those technologies and say, okay, well, I'm interested in developing in this area, or I'm interested in developing in a different area, and that might mean separating and working for another company. I think people need to understand as well that the companies need to be competitive. Going forward in the future, their development is definitely a part of that. So people who don't want to develop, and you see a lot of that as well, they need to recognize that if they're not going to learn and develop, the company is not going to have a whole lot of reason to keep them around. So if you want a future, you've got to be learning and developing all of the time as well.
Yeah, and in the book, you sort of give some pointers or guidelines, I guess, on how an individual employee, how do you look at your capabilities and sort of brand and market yourself as in the direction of the contribution you can make, which is an interesting way to think about it, because I don't know if most people go to the extreme of saying, I'm sort of a product here rather than a producer.
Right, and I think that's an important perspective. We all need to be, I think, thinking a little bit more entrepreneurial. That doesn't necessarily mean that people have to be entrepreneurs. I get a lot of questions about that, but you need to be thinking about, well, what is my value? What is my value proposition? Because if you don't know what your value is, how is anybody else going to recognize that and understand it, especially as we move forward with all of these new technologies? Say, well, how are you going to help us? What value are you to the company? And everybody should be able to articulate what that is.
All right. So with that in mind, how will automation disrupt training itself? What will that process of, reskilling and upskilling employees look like in 5 or 10 years from now?
So I think there's some exciting developments in that area as well. So there's 2 parts to that, right? There's how training is delivered. And I think there's a lot of articles about that, from simulations and virtual reality. I think, one of the exciting ways that you can do this is you can expose leaders, for example, through virtual reality simulations to all kinds of situations before they even arise, right? The most important way to be prepared for any kind of a situation that you might occur is to have experienced it before, right? 'Cause that's why we like to look for experienced leaders, because they've experienced many different situations. Well, now you can give leaders even more situations through realistic simulations. So that would be just one. The other area that I think is exciting is opening up the possibilities of what are you training people in? And so part of that is about new tasks and new technologies. But I think the other thing is, and I touch on this in the book, is, about what does it mean for you personally? If you're going to be competing increasingly with machines are taking on increasing amounts of human tasks. The answer for us as humans is not to try to be more like machines, right? It's to dive deeper into who we are as people. And so I think we'll have to see more and more training to help and assist people to understand more about themselves and how they fit into this kind of dynamic environment.
There's probably also some aspect of better identification or perhaps predictive identification of training need that could happen. It ties into, there's a model that we have here at trainingindustry.com called the modern learning system, which essentially looks at various facets of the training process in an organization, all coupled together with data layers and how we manage that data to trigger training events is one part of what we see now. So I can only imagine that as we develop technologies that are smarter about being predictive about flagging what we'll need next week or 2 weeks from now or a month from now to generate more efficient business processes, or to avoid liability or manage business disruption, or that's whatever the outcome is. I can only imagine that what we're talking about with this predictive learning technology is going to theoretically make training more effective.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said for analytics and predictive analytics that can help. First of all, just recognize issues and problems, and then 2, to deliver the training that you need, and hopefully now deliver it right at the appropriate time. Whether that's looking for issues with systems or new technologies, or even perhaps ethical issues that might be circulating around, and to say, hey, it seems like there are some issues like this happening. It's time for some sort of ethical training, maybe a training on sexual harassment, or training on some other topic like that, where people need more of that right now for whatever reason. Because the workplace and the people in it is always dynamic, and so and they respond to cues from their leaders. So what kinds of training are needed in that area as well?
So Larry, at the end of the day, with what you know about automation and artificial intelligence, particularly in the workplace, would you call yourself an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to, how this situation is going to shape out and the impact that it's going to have on us as people and as employees?
I like to think of myself as being optimist, but also kind of a realist. I think, when we hear a lot of the discussion about automation and robotics, it goes down one of two paths usually. One is it's going to be a disaster for working people and there's going to be mass unemployment. Or the second way is everything is going to be perfectly fine. And what it misses is the in-between stuff, which is from an individual standpoint, you could suffer from disruption. And so what I want people to understand is technology is going to advance. There's going to be lots of tremendous opportunities there, right? But the opportunities are only going to be there if you're prepared for them. All right, you have to be ready to take advantage of them. You have to be ready to recognize them, and you have to be ready to take action when you see those opportunities. And if you're not doing that, that's where the trouble can happen. And that's happened in every industrial revolution. We talk about the Luddites, right? Well, the Luddites were actually correct in some ways, right? Their careers were destroyed, and it didn't take long for that to happen. The mistake is that they fought, progress in technology, and so rather than adapting and using what they learned and their skills that they had to develop and move along with the technology, they fought it, and then they lost. And so I think that's an important lesson from history, right? Look forward, learn and adapt. Don't try to fight it or just try to wait out the clock and hope that you retire before technology disrupts you. Right? There's tremendous opportunity. Learn how you can take advantage of it.
And it demands ongoing, lifelong, sort of pervasive learning to keep up with the pace.
Absolutely. It's learning, and it's across multiple areas. So we all have to take responsibility for that ourselves, as individuals, and hopefully, corporations and government policymakers can also provide insight and direction as to where to go, because it's hard for any one person to know all of those answers. So it does help to know what the direction is.
The book is The Robot in the Next Cubicle, What You Need to Know to Adapt and Succeed in the Automation Age. Larry Boyer, the author, thanks very much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
And as always, you can learn more about this topic on our website, trainingindustry.com, and also listen to our previous episodes. Until next time.
If you have feedback about this episode or would like to suggest a topic for a future program, email us at info@trainingindustry.com or use the Contact Us page at trainingindustry.com. Thanks for listening to the Training Industry Podcast.